Welcome to Bella Podcast. Hang felt more secure. Before leaving, Mr. Lone thanked her and sent her some sweets from the US. Only now did she notice that there were many gift packages in the house that were candy like that. We planned to give it to relatives and neighbors. But when we got back, that's how things are. People don't want to see us either, so I'm worried about receiving such a gift. I understand them, he said, trying to sound calm and understanding but still a little bitter. Then he walked out the door, looked back and forth very carefully before looking at Dan as if signaling she was okay. Don't misunderstand. I just want the best for her. If they see that you are in contact with us, they may not even isolate you. I don't want her to be disadvantaged because of helping my family. At this point, Dan was able to string together a series of previous odd actions of Mr. Lone. She sighed. Uncle, you can explain to them the way you explained to me earlier. I feel very convinced. They don't listen. It turned out that the couple had a son. This guy a few years ago was suspected of murder. Then during the investigation, he couldn't stand the pressure and took his own life. As for the two grandparents, bearing the status of the murderer's parents, they suffered enough detractors and scandals that they had to immigrate with their daughter to America. Every year, on the day of the son's coaxing, they return to Vietnam to worship and commemorate. Originally, they didn't want to listen to us, adding untrue news online, old stories and new stories. They almost isolated us in 2 rings of barbed wire. He joked, but no one laughed. Then when Dan was choosing words to ease his frustration, he exhaled and said a sentence that she would haunt forever. Sometimes the stigma is more than the plague, don't you see? The plague, fast or slow, sooner or later, people will find a way to control and eliminate it at some point. The stigma is not. Now sitting and looking at the old couple from this side of the window, Dan recalls the conversation in the morning. His heart can't help but have many thoughts. But then her throat was uncomfortably dry. And it seems that the sleep just now hasn't made the headache go away. She closed her eyes for a long time to let her senses relax. But just when she felt a little better, there was a loud scream. Looks like from the other side of the street. Dan opened her eyes and what she saw was Mr. Lone's panicked face on the other side of the window. He looked at her without blinking, then gave her a somewhat bitter smile. Almost guessing that something was wrong, Dan immediately ran to the opposite house. Mrs. Hang slipped and fell, and is lying motionless. Dan checked her pulse and heart rate was still there, but when she called her, she didn't respond. Mr. Lone seemed confused and almost just sat desperately rubbing his wife's feet. Dan understands he needs more support. She rushed out and shouted. Several doors nearby were open. A few people started to step back to the throne of Mr. Lone, but then they seemed to remember something and stopped.